Good afternoon. We are thrilled to be here for our second session of Jewish topics and 20th century artists. It is wonderful to see you. Before I introduce our guests for the day, I just want to remind you and share for those who are new to the class this week, the inspiration behind this class. About a month ago, installed in our lobby, it's an incredible Dali sculpture of the Western Wall. And it prompted us to think about how Jewish events inform art of the 20th century. There are two major events in the life cycle of the Jewish people in the 20th century, the Holocaust and the birth of the State of Israel. But there are also many, many events from the beginning of the century, pogroms, to the end of the century. It is ironic that a part of the world that was a hot point for the Jewish people 120 years ago is again so in the news. And it is powerful to think about how artists use the lens of these events to convey their feelings about them and their emotions about them and their reflections upon them. And as beautiful synchronicity happens, as I was putting together this month of classes inspired by the Dali in our lobby, Linda Holtz emailed staff, and Linda's here, Linda and Chuck are here, I see you, that her sister-in-law's friend, Dr. Carol Salas, is an art history professor. She has a PhD from the Ohio State University in art history, a master's in art history from the University of Cincinnati. And she has personal connection, we'll hear about in our third class, to a very famous artist, Roy Lichtenstein, just a very knowledgeable person. And so for the next 3 weeks, Carol is with us to help us understand some very specific things about art and the perception of the 20th century events that affected the Jewish people. Next week, along with Susan Podolsky, who will be by my side, Susan and I will be in front of that Dali sculpture, and Carol will be in Ohio talking about the complexity of the artist and the human being that Dali was. And for those of you who missed last week, the recording with my overview of what we are doing this month is available on our Temple Bethel YouTube channel. But today, we thought that a perfect lecture of Carol's to look at would be what she discusses about the representation of the Holocaust in contemporary art and how memorials try to take events that are unfathomable and put them into concrete and paint and whatever other medium that someone used. And so it is a absolute honor to have Dr. Carol Salas with us. She is so diligent and has worked so hard in terms of fitting her broad range of knowledge and experience into what we are trying to do this month. And Carol, I can't thank you enough for being with us. And so I'm going to thank Jake, Jake Harris, our awesome producer who always gets us started, even under the greatest of pressures. And Carol, you are mic'd, and I'm going to ask you to unmute, and your PowerPoint is already on screen. And Carol, I'm going to let you, Dr. Salas, I'm going to let you take it away. Welcome to Temple Bethel.
Thank you. Can you all hear me?
Yes, we hear you great.
Okay. I want to first thank Rabbi Mates and the congregation. I'm glad to meet you. And I want to thank Linda Holtz for introducing me to all of you and making this possible. Let me talk, and then I think I would like that you have questions or comments at the end. Okay? Winston Churchill stated that the Holocaust was the worst crime in the history of the world. So the question comes, how do you commemorate such a crime of stupendous proportions. And Henry Moore, who you can see here in this image, chaired the first Holocaust commission, a committee to select an artist who would create, and this was in the late 50s, a monument for Auschwitz-Birkenau. The committee was called the International Committee of Auschwitz. 426 entries were submitted to Henry Moore and his jury from 36 different countries. And it concluded that the jury could find none that were what they felt appropriate. Henry Moore, in his announcement, said they really couldn't decide because he said, how do you satisfactorily memorialize a crime of such depth and such horror? And he left the final things that he said in his statement to all 426 entries from 36 countries. Is it in fact possible to create a work of art that can express the emotions engendered by Auschwitz? And remember, this was the late 50s. I think many of the findings came out even later of all the atrocities. And then, whoops, this is not the forward. Let me see. Okay. Then what happened was there was, over many years, there was finally established, this went on literally for 17 years, debating about a memorial and how to do it. And there were a number of internationally renowned sculptors and architects who were invited to compete. The winner of this international competition, you can see here, is Peter Eisenman. And in fact, I interviewed him in Manhattan, and I was in Berlin. I went to this monument twice. And the first time when I was there, I interviewed the archivist, and I learned a great deal about it. And in fact, Eisenman, when I spoke to him in Manhattan, he said, how can you memorialize the Holocaust? He said, it's really an impossible issue. But he created his monument, which you see here, is 4.7 acres. And these concrete stelae or pillars are abstract. There's nothing on them. And this is in central Berlin. And the issue was the monument had to be in Berlin because Berlin was the center of this murderous regime. And there was a need, obviously, for a monument. It was an act of national conscience. And Eisenman explained to me how he created it and what he did. And I think the first thing that I want to explain is the name. When you go there, there's no explanation. And there are people who go there, I saw this, take a camera, and they're on the bus and they go. If you want to learn, you have to spend time there. So I want to show you and explain to you, first of all, the meaning in German. It's not just a memorial. I'll show you what I mean. In Germany, there are many of these monuments, and this is called in German a Denkmal. This particular one is a symbol of Germania. And this was for the unification of the German Empire in 1871. And a Denkmal comes from the German verb gedenken, which means to remember. And you can have a gedenken for, let's say they would have one for Beethoven or for Goethe or for war victims. It's not a particularly powerful name. And then what I want to show you is what this is called, and that's what's so significant. The term Mahnmal comes from the German verb mahnen. And if you get a warning that you haven't paid your gas bill, it's called a Mahnung. And it's really what Mahnung means, to warn. to admonish. It's not just to remember. It's a memorial set up to warn people not to repeat what has happened in history. It's a very powerful word. And so what we see here, and I picked this particular image because you can see Eisenman told me anything goes. The monument, 2,711 pillars, and you can enter from any side. You can go in there 24 hours. People go in there and they sunbathe, they eat ice cream. I saw everything. The kids run around in there, they play hide and seek, and you can really get lost there. So the verb itself, mahnung, comes from to warn, to admonish. It makes it far more significant. These pillars that you see here, some of them are a foot high, so people sit on them and they check their phones, and some of them are over 15 feet high. So you get an idea of what this is like. When you walk through them, you can easily get lost. You can get disoriented, or minimally, you can feel confined. It's a really quite scary feeling. You can hear the sounds of the city, but you can't see. So there is a feeling in there of what are you going to do? And I remember being in there and thinking, I got to get out of here. And there's a maze of these concrete pillars. And you can see some of the people walking through. And particularly, I saw so many tourist buses. They stopped for 5 minutes or whatever. They learned nothing about it. There's no sign there other than Manmao. And that's it. That is their experience. So let me show you how he designed this. You can see over here, you see how the ground undulates. And he told me he did this intentionally. There's really not level earth. And this is to make it more dangerous, that you don't know when the ground is going up or down. So I think on some level, he wants people to experience the fear that people who really experienced the Holocaust went through. You can hide there and you won't find your way out too easily. So it poses definitely a feeling of fear in you. Let me show you some more of the images. These are people who have left flowers there. And in the background, you can see these beautiful, the American Embassy is nearby, the Brandenburg Gate is nearby, and where Hitler's bunker was, it's actually built over that area. So it's very centrally located in Berlin. And then this is really, I think, the really interesting part. This was not designed by Eisenman. And this is an underground documentation center. And you take steps and you go under the earth. And there is so much information. It really explains very well. So when you come in, and what I noticed, I went there twice, it's quiet. I think people, no matter what, are just shocked by what they see. And over here is historical documentation, starting with 1933, the rise of the Nazi Party, and ending with 1941, with over 1 million Jews being killed in Russia. So you get information, and then you see these faces, and it really represents well how everyone was killed. Little girls, Orthodox, business people, all kinds of, every Jew was a victim. And then the next room, this was, each room to me was overwhelming. This room you can see, and it's dark. So you really feel you're underground, and you see these illuminated display cases. And here you can read letters people left behind. And people, as they left their homes, left messages to their loved ones, not having any idea where they were going. Some of these letters were left people going into trains and dropping the letters. So this is really very personal and very moving information. And above, this was very interesting. You can see the ceiling. These are coffered ceilings, and they reflect above. And then it makes it even more seem like you're in a graveyard. So this is the atmosphere. And then you go into the room of families, and that explains the life of 15 Jewish families. And you go in there and you can read what happened to each of the 15 families. Then there is the room of names, and this left me speechless. You can see here one name, and I wrote it down, and I was there 2010, and I actually made a note and I kept it because I just couldn't get over it. You hear in English, German, and I think in Hebrew, I can't remember, but I wrote down, and this is what it said. These are names which were all received from Yad Vashem. They're all Jewish Holocaust victims. And this is the one that I heard. And while you hear the announcement, you see the name of the individual who was killed. And this is what I wrote down. Tibor Roth was born in Romania. He was murdered immediately upon arrival by suffocation in the gas chamber. He was 5 years old. It never left me. I kept it when I left there. And then the next room is called the Room of Sites. And in there are, there's a map with the various sites of the camps. And then there's state-of-the-art technology in which you can see eyewitness accounts, people talking about what they saw, historic photographs, and film footage. Some of the executions were filmed. And what you see here is really the sites of persecution and extermination. So this was, I think, extremely powerful. And I wanted to select 3 European monuments to look at and 3 American. And the next one I went to was in Paris. And this is, I think, a fairly unknown monument. It's tucked behind Notre Dame. And had I not heard about it from someone, I would have never known it existed. And the architect is Georges-Henri Pinguisson. He was a student of the great architect Le Corbusier. And in order to reach this, there's one sign. If you miss the sign, I don't know how you find it. It's really small. And you go down some narrow steps, and it's really a crypt. So here you can see, here's the one sign. And then along the wall in red paint, so it looks like blood, what it says is 200,000 French martyrs killed in the camps and deportation sites from 1940 to 45. And you see this here carved in red ink, symbolizing blood. Here's what you see. And then over here, you can see the entranceway, and it looks like a prison. And you go in, and over here, it's only open at certain times. And when you see, the first thing you see are these great big black metal bars. And on them are these triangles, which look like barbed wire, especially from a distance. And you enter and you see absolutely prison bars. But you enter from here and you go into this dark corridor. And what is here are pebbles, quartz pebbles. And this is, of course, the Jewish tradition of placing stones on a graveside of a loved one. And all of these quartz petals are backlighted so that you can see, it's not very clear where you're walking. And when you first enter, there are statements by Sartre in French talking about actually apathy and the moral indignation of what was going on and the need for conscience. So it's very powerful. And it's on the walls before you start walking down here. And further down at the end of the corridor is a map of France, and it shows Vichy France. And each town, there are a number of how many Jews were deported from those particular towns. And this is about, I spent maybe a half an hour in here, but it's quiet, it's silent. And at the very end, there is a rotunda. And the rotunda is in the shape of the Star of David. And at the very, very end, it said, "Forgive, but don't forget." So here you can see this long, darkened hall, which is a reminder of what took place. It's a very deep chamber, and the starkness of it is a lasting effect. And one thing I realized in going there is that it doesn't provide information like some of the other memorials, but what it does provide is quiet, and you think there about what happened. It really, I think, is a place for silent reflection on all the lives lost here, 200,000 French Jews. And this came to me, I wrote a dissertation on the artist R.B. Kitaj, who was an American expatriate. And he told me about the place, otherwise I would have never known. But here he shows himself as an old man, led by his little son. And he told me the son is reading about the atrocities and he's following him. And he said he needed some kind of a walker. So for a walker, he used a chimney. And in many of his paintings, he uses the chimney for its symbolic value. And he told me, here is a woman who's facing the gas chamber. And above is the monument that we just saw, the one right behind Notre Dame. So this woman is about to go in there. And he told me this figure is based on a series of sculptures Matisse did called Backs. And I think there's a copy in Paris and definitely at Museum of Modern Art in New York. And this was inspired by Van Gogh's The Hospital Corridors, where he was hospitalized in Arles. This is another monument in Vienna. And I found this fascinating because I've never seen it, and I've been to Vienna, but when I was there, this wasn't there yet. And this is in the inner city of Vienna, which was formerly in medieval Vienna, the center was where the Jews lived. And it's called the Uden Plots. And this monument, it was built in the year 2000, and it is an inverted library. And the idea of the library is connected to Jewish, I think, thinking that the Jews are associated with people of the book. And when you see this monument, the architect, who is British, had very limited space to work within. And this is about 32 feet by 23 feet. I wrote down the dimensions somewhere. But it's 32 feet by 22 feet by 13. And it sits on a stone plinth. And what is interesting about it is, here are the doors of the library, but there are no knobs, there are no handles. So you can't go in, you can't go out. And the books, the spines of the books are all inside. You only see the leaves. And the idea is to make you, provoke you, to challenge you to think about the knowledge in the books, the lives eradicated, and the impossibility of it. I wrote down here, the books make reference to a knowledge base that has been eradicated, as the lives of many of these authors have stopped short. And here is commemoration, and Vienna had more than 65,000 Jews were murdered from Vienna. And I wanted to say this as an aside. If you go to Berlin in the Jewish Museum, there's a library. And I went there and I saw books of the deportations from Vienna. And you can go there and see district by district, how methodically the Jews were picked up. You can actually see in the book how the Nazis worked, address by address. So this inside out library is to make you think about terrible losses and knowledge lost. Here you can see along the sides the names of the various camps where they were taken. And here you can see how it's really not very large, but she had limited space. And with this particular monument, it is, you're not supposed to sit on it, which is the opposite of Eisenman, where anything goes. This really shows far more respect for the victims. And what I wanted to show was, and this can be done with, I think, many cities in Europe, the depth of anti-Semitism in the city. Here you can see is Jewish life in the 18th century in this area called the Uden Plots. And there was a synagogue in here, and the medieval synagogue you can visit if you go underground. How it was discovered, when this was built, they discovered through the excavating the area, a synagogue underground. And in 1421, there were terrible pogrom, and many of the Jews actually went to the synagogue and committed suicide rather than convert to Catholicism. Many were burned, and it burned also in the synagogue, and many were expelled from the city. My point, and I'll show you more, anti-Semitism was nothing new to these cities. Here, I think it's a wonderful example of Gustav Mahler. Mahler, in order to rise to the top position in the Vienna State Opera, converted. He knew, and I actually saw there was a bylaw that does not allow Jews to get the top position because they believed a Jew can't conduct a German opera. So Mahler converted, and after his conversion, he was still hounded by anti-Semitic press. They opposed him. And he became certainly one of the most outstanding conductors for his interpretations of Mozart, of Tchaikovsky, of Wagner, and certainly his own music. I think it's just beautiful beyond words. Toward the end of his short life, Mahler also had conducting positions at the Metropolitan Opera and the New York Philharmonic. And once the Anschluss took place, the Anschluss is the annexation of Austria into Germany, Jews were forced to clean the streets. And here you can see there were people who wrote signs against this, the German invasion. So the Jews were forced to get on their knees and use their hands. And the Nazis here kicked them and poured terrible acid on their hands to wipe off the paint on the pavement. And over here, you can see this was another kind of public humiliation. This started in March 38. Here's a Jewish man and another Jewish man, and they're carrying paintbrushes and paint. And what they had to do, part of their public humiliation, was to paint the word Jude on Jewish-owned businesses. So here you can see again, and I wanted to show this. This is Kurt Waldheim was for years Secretary General of the United Nations. And then he became president of Austria. And then Nazi hunting, I think, became far more intense. And it was discovered he was complicit in the murders. And he was not allowed into the United States. So here he was elected president, but he couldn't get in the US. But other countries greeted him, and I think the Pope did. I'm not sure. Then, this is very interesting. On the issue of libraries, in Berlin, there is this memorial, which is created by an Israeli sculptor, Micha Ullman. And what it is a subterranean library. There are empty bookshelves under the ground. This is covered with a glass pane, and you can see the original cobblestones. And this is on the site where the original major book burning took place. There were many other book burnings, but this was the big one in May 1933. So here you have this empty library, and it has enough books for 22,000 copies of books to be held. Here you can see the book burning, in which there were burned books by Jews, Marxists, socialists. And here in front of the square, it describes the event. And over here, this is another interesting story. On the next medal, Heinrich Heine was a German poet and playwright and essayist. And in 1821, first of all, he converted, another one who converted to get ahead. He was born Jewish and converted. And he wrote in the play about books being burned because the books had political and religious controversy. And he made a statement, which is embossed here, and it says, "Where books will burn, people will also burn." And how true. And this was 1821. And then the architect, Rachel Whiteread, who's British, she felt her memorial had the most to do with the Vietnam Memorial in Washington. And first of all, she didn't have the immense space that Maya Lin had for hers, but she felt that there was a human impact by people walking to her monument, her empty library. And with Maya Lin's, I think there's no monument like this. It's certainly one of the most moving monuments in the world because you can touch it. You can take paper and you make tracings of the thousands of people who lost their lives or were missing in action. And I think that has a lot to do with the success of this minimalist monument. And then in America, I did this because Linda Holtz suggested it to me, and it was really a very interesting monument. This is the New England Holocaust Memorial, and there was a huge competition for this. There were, let me see how many, unbelievable, over 500 entries for this, 520 entries. The architect who won for his Holocaust Memorial is a native of Johannesburg who came to the US in 1976, and he had the winning work. And this is located in Boston, right on the Freedom Trail. And I'll show you, it's near Faneuil Hall and Quincy Market. And he was awarded, he got 2 major awards for his memorial. One was from the American Institute of Architects, and they have a specific award for memorial architecture. And it's only been awarded 8 times. And Satowitz, the architect, received the 8th award in the 32-year history of this award. And what you see here is also the Boston Society of Architects said about this work, it's really very touching. He said, the New England Holocaust Memorial is architecture with a soul. It challenges its visitors to consider what they value. This is perhaps as great a contribution as a work of architecture can make. So what he has created are 6 towers. Each of them, when you enter them, has the name of 6 of the major camps. The towers are 54 feet high, made of glass. And here you can see how they look. I've never been there. And as you enter, you see these black marble openings with Shoah. And inside, the events are described, those leading specifically up to the Wannsee Conference and the propositioning of the death factories. And that's here because this is what it's all about, the camps themselves. That's what this memorial marks. You can see people going in. And as you go in, words in Hebrew and in English, remember. And look in this image and you can see steam. The steam is almost constant and it symbolizes the smoke coming from the chimneys of the crematoriums. And then here you see in Hebrew and in English, here you see the steam.
That was Yiddish, Carol. That was Yiddish. It's Hebrew letters, but it was a Yiddish word, actually.
I didn't. Oh, I'm glad you told me.
Yeah.
I didn't know. Okay. And then there are grids, and there is a grid in front of each of the towers with the names of the camps. And then in the grid, down below, the grids are 6 feet deep. And each chamber is lined with black concrete, and then there are lights. And the lights shine, especially at night, they're effective. So you see these towers representing darkness, and then the light creates beams at night. So it must be very dramatic to see this. And then you can see on each tower are 1 million numbers. These are the numbers tattooed on the victims. And then in between the towers, there are historical, let me go back for a second. I just want to show you. Between the towers, they're inscribed on the glass historical facts about various victims and heroes. And then on the glass, various survivors from different camps have left messages. And I want to just read to you 2 of them that I could figure out. One of them says, once you cross the gate to the camp, there is no chance to get out of here alive. And then another one wrote, Jessie, a childhood friend of mine, once found a raspberry in the camp and carried it in her pocket all day to present to me that night on a leaf. Imagine a world in which your only possession is one raspberry and you give it to your friend. So what you see in here is a fusion of numbers, personal and historical narrative. And then when you go out, there is the statement, which is most touching, I think, by the Lutheran pastor, Martin Niemöller. And he says, first they came for the communists. This is really about apathy. And I think it gives you something to think about. People who just let it happen and did nothing. And I didn't speak out because I wasn't a communist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I didn't speak out because I wasn't a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I didn't speak out because I wasn't a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak out for me. So that's the last thing you see. And then it says, I think as you leave, a statement in Yiddish, remember, like you said. And then I wanted to show, this is New York's Holocaust Museum. This is in Lower Manhattan. And there was also an invitational competition to create a memorial here for this New York Holocaust Museum. And the Garden of Stones was created. And the sculptor who won this invitational competition is very well known for creating sculpture out of nature, always natural materials. He has become so well known that he is an officer of the Order of the British Empire. His name is Andy Goldsworthy, and his design won. And what he said about it is that he said, this is for the memory of those who perished and to honor the victims. And he involved, to honor the survivors, and he involved the survivors with the garden that he created. And how he started is his own migration. And the stones have a lot of white marks on them. And he said that's because they were transported from place to place. He found the stones in a farm, and these are huge boulders They weighed between 15 tons to 3 tons. And somehow he transported the stones from Vermont to Connecticut. And in Connecticut, he worked with a quarry, and these holes were created by a blowtorch. And then finally, from Connecticut, they were transported to a holding yard in Brooklyn. And from Brooklyn, they were taken and lifted by crane to this location here in Lower Manhattan. And here you can see one of the survivors. And he started, how this came about is that he created this so that there was a ceremony and the survivors and their families were there for the planting. And he said, this is a big risk. He said, when you take a tree and plant it, where will it grow and where will it not grow? And so here you can see how these look with the holes that were blowtorch. And the survivors put soil in here with their families. And then he got these little saplings. And these are from, this must have been a fused tree, chestnut and an oak tree. And he said, I didn't want any delicate trees. I didn't want any beautiful trees. And he said, literally, he didn't want anything decorative. He said what he wanted for these, he said the trees have to be tough little SOBs. And they managed, they stayed through this. So these brute stones show the markings of all their migrations, a lot of them, but they're there. And you can see here how they started to grow. And he said that the impossible is made possible through this. He didn't think it would work, that they would grow, but they did. And the garden is meant to be visited and revisited. And many of the survivors and their families go there and tend to the garden to keep it up. And then what you see here, he selected 18 stones. And the reason he selected the stones is because of the significance of 18 and the letter Chai. And so there are in here, again, the tradition of placing stones on the gravesite of a loved one. So he uses the stones, and the number 18 is significant. And what you see from here, you can see how the trees are beautifully growing. And when you walk to the very edge of the garden, and you see it's very small, and the museum is actually located at the very tip of Manhattan. And you can look out and you can see the Statue of Liberty and Ellis Island. So what could be more appropriate for a Holocaust garden than for survivors to see where they found their new life in this country? And during the pandemic, a rabbi went there and for Rosh Hashanah, and you can see him there with his shofar. And then there's another part of the garden. And this is called the children's tree. And there are a number of places throughout the country that started with saplings from a tree that was planted in Theresienstadt, which was then Czechoslovakia. And as you know, there were many children who were imprisoned there. And the Nazis kept up some pretense by letting the children be in a learning situation. And from among the adult prisoners who wanted to teach the children, there was one woman, and I found out her name was Irma Lasher. And on Tu B'Shvat, she taught the children about this day of planting. And she took the sapling, and this is over 80 years old that this tree started. And they planted it, and the children were supposed to use the water that they were rationed for that day to start the tree. So today, this is a silver maple, and it's still blossoming. And I read a very touching statement about this. As far as the children, this was in 1943. when the Jewish children planted this tree in recognition of Tu B'Shvat. There were 15,000 Jewish children from Theresienstadt who were killed. There were fewer than 200 survivors. And today, the ambassador to the UN, Linda Thomas Greenfield, said about this, there are different ways of telling the stories of the Holocaust. For me personally, the story of this tree is one of the most powerful I have ever come across. And there are branches of the tree in Jerusalem, Chicago, San Francisco, and Philadelphia. And now there's a home for it in New York. And the last one I want to show you is by George Segal. And here you can see Dianne Feinstein when she was mayor of San Francisco. And she was in charge of a committee to build a Holocaust memorial. And the committee was comprised of survivors as well as members from the Jewish community who were interested and people from the art museum who were interested in doing this. And their goals were twofold: to have a memorial specifically dedicated to the Holocaust, that this would be a space just for Holocaust memory, and to have a great public work, a major work of art for the city that would be a drawing attraction. And they were invited really famous architects. The two Israelis, Yaakov Agam and Menashe Kadishman. And there is an Agam memorial in New Orleans, which looks like Disneyland. But you can see it and you can look it up. In fact, I talked to the rabbi there and I told him and he didn't like it, but that's how I felt. It's colorful, it's rainbow-like. Anyway, both the Israelis were invited. Louise Nevelson, who has done a sculpture about the Holocaust, Henry Moore, Isamu Noguchi, Juan Miro, and Max Lieberman, who himself was a survivor, a refugee. And selected was George Segal. And here you can see him. And Segal was, by this time, by the 80s, very well known. He was a distinguished sculptor, a member identified initially with pop art. His works have been shown in Europe, all over the United States, in galleries, and he has sculptures in, I think, most major museums, both here and in Europe, and I don't know other countries. But what you see here is Segal made statements that I think are very powerful. He made two versions. One is in Manhattan. This is in the Jewish Museum in New York. And the one in San Francisco is outdoors. And Segal said that, I'll read you his statement. First, he said that his own family, both his parents, lost almost all their relatives who were living in Europe. And he said, this sculpture is about my own intensely felt feelings. And what you can see here is his own dedication and what he said when you see this. I just want to read, he said, we will never forget the genocidal slaughter of Jews, including 1.5 million children. We will never forget the cruel apathy that allowed the Holocaust and the deliberate, I can't read the other part of it, of other people. Anyway, you can see this, but we will never forget the
murder, the deliberate murder of millions of other people to happen.
I can't see the rest of it. It's a very strong statement. And these are his own words. And then what we see here coming up, he said that I must have looked at 1,000 photographs. And he was completely, he said, the obscenity of heaps of dead people. And he said that this showed the arrogant contempt for this kind of disregard for death of the Germans, just throwing people down. And he said, I determined that I would have to make a heap of bodies that would be expressive of this arrogance and disorder. And over here you can see the actual works. And I tried to get photographs of the details and I was unable to. Here you see the one survivor, and here are the bodies that have been gassed and the way they fall down. There is a son that has fallen over the father has fallen over the dead son. There are two women, and one of the women, he put a bitten apple in her hand as a statement of survival, that she was gassed while she still had a piece of food in her hand that she was trying to eat. Anyway, this was his idea, that he wanted to show what the starvation led to. And then these are some of the details, and they're really not too much detail on the bodies that he made. And in order to do this, he actually tested, when he began working with his plastic figures that he became so well known for. Oh, here you can see the woman, and she has a bitten apple in her hand, and she's lying there on the stomach of a man. They're just tossed there into just a big heap. But in order to do this, when he started making sculpture, he practiced on himself. And he would take strips of cotton gauze and dip it in plaster and then work it into a cast. And then he asked his friends to pose. And he told them they had to go down on the ground, they had to collapse. And then he said to them, imagine that you're dead. And he asked people who were young and old. And he said that it is fitting that silent art represent the muted voices that were forever still in the Holocaust. So this is how he actually did the process. And then what he used, he said, this very famous photograph from Buchenwald of Margaret Burke White. And he used this figure in the center as the guide for this figure. And he described it. And he said the sole survivor is in the costume, and he tried to show even the stripes in the costume of what he's wearing, the stripes that they all wore. And then the figure, you can see, he's not looking at anything. He must be completely lost in thought. And behind him are the dead in a heap. And imagine when you see this, how did this man feel to be alive when everybody behind him is dead? There must be also some guilt in survival. But the model who he did, he said, is an Israeli friend of his who was a survivor. And he said, I have a need to try to be authentic in what I do. So a real Israeli survivor who he knew was the model. And today, the memorial, this is how it looks today. There are people there who come there often and treat it like it's a graveyard. They have, for example, ceremonies for Kristallnacht and also for Yom HaShoah are held here. And Siegel said something really beautiful about sculpture, that sculpture, and this is certainly a commemorative work, sculpture is designed to educate people so that when people come here, they think about what does it mean to be human, to care about an individual. What does tolerance mean? And what does respect mean? And this is perhaps what his many, many works are very effective. So that's the end of my talk. And
So, Carol, a couple of comments. The first thing I want to share, which I happened to be in Miami yesterday, so we drove by it. I don't know if you ever saw the Miami Holocaust Memorial in person. No. It's very guttural and if you get down here to visit Linda and Chuck one day, these are bodies and a tattooed arm. It's about a 20-foot high arm reaching up to the sky, and there are bodies throughout climbing up. It's very guttural. It reminded me a little bit of the seagull. Feel free to put questions in the chat or unmute yourself. I just wanted to just two reflections. One, I have a daughter who's an architecture major at UF, and they just met with the couple that was chosen to design the Obama Library. And one of the things I was thinking about, which is so interesting, kind of pre all these memorials exist, is the process of vetting the designer and picking a design, and how the heck, you decide who gets that design. Like, why is someone chosen? Why is not? And I'm curious if there's any, like the New Orleans one we talked about, you think was a mistake to make that the memorial, just the complexity of even, it came to mind when I saw all the numbers on the Boston sculpture, like the thought of what that would take to put all those numbers there and how long that must have taken. That's my first comment. The second is, which also the Boston sculpture made me think about, is Jewish versus Holocaust at large. So when I see 6 and anything that represents Holocaust, I think 6 million. I think there's a challenge for anyone who's marking the Holocaust. Is it a Jewish marking, where you focus on the 6 million, or do you focus on all the loss of life? And I think that's probably a complicated thing to navigate as well. I don't know if you want to address either of those comments, and if there's any others.
You want me to?
Yeah.
No.
Yeah.
Let me think. I don't know what to say immediately. It's a very, very difficult issue. I think in picking them, they were all, at least like with the San Francisco Memorial, Siegel, they all were well known. Every artist that they asked was very well known. And Siegel was picked by his design. I don't know what else. Agam, after I saw the work in New Orleans, and I only saw it through images, he's really lightweight. What he created there is a rainbow of colors. It has nothing to do with mourning. But these other monuments in Boston is very powerful. The thinking behind, as you said, etching 6 million numbers on the glass and etching survivors' tales and facts. All these things are etched. The tremendous amount of thought and labor, and that convincing a committee to do this, that this would be, and you can see how successful these are.
It's so interesting. Very interesting.
The Garden of Stones speaks for itself, that out of these stones comes life, that these trees grow up. And he said he didn't want a tree that's decorative. So it's very forceful imagery.
Yeah, these are powerful things to visit. I don't see any questions in the chat or anyone unmuting. So I want to thank you, Dr. Salas, so much. This is fascinating. Next week, I think, is the Jewel of the Month, which is delving into the Dolly to Toph Carroll's. And we've had a lot of Sturm and Drang, because Dolly was a very complicated individual, and that's okay to recognize. And look, the 20th century gave us a lot to chew on, unfortunately, from the beginning to the end. And all these things are not away. Unfortunately, there are many residues still around. So it is important that we see that, how artists express that. We want to thank everyone. I want to thank Jake, our awesome producer. Dr. Salas, we'll see you next week. And thank you, everyone. This is just top-notch excellent. Thank you so much. Take care, everyone. Be well. Bye-bye.